Okay, we're continuing our study of Genesis versus evolution, or creation versus evolution. This is tape in session number 21. The date is June 19th, 1995. Tonight we're getting into the study of embryology, vestigial organs, and homology. Yeah. That's right. I said 19th. It is the 17th. 16th. It's the 16th. Start over. This is June 16th, 1995.
Come on.
Thank you.
Just lost 3 days.
Okay. All right, let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, we do thank and praise you again for the privilege of being together, for the joy of knowing you because of and through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and the privilege we have of having your word. We thank you, Lord, for what you've told us concerning what you've done to bring everything into existence. We thank you that your word stands up against those who would attack it and those who would imagine in their vain imaginations how things came to pass accidentally. We thank you that your word is true. We thank you for the study as we become more in awe of you every week as we see further the truth of your creation account compared to the evolutionary fantasies of those who would deny you. We thank you, Lord, for what you're going to show us tonight now. We commit this time into your hands for your glory, and thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, as I said, tonight we're getting into the study of embryology, vestigial organs, and if you don't know what these things are, we'll explain them when we get there, and homology. Last week we just barely got going on the matter of embryology. Now these are 3 more areas that the evolutionists try to bring up to support their evolutionary reasonings and claim that in these various studies and fields that you will find evidence of evolution. So we need to look at them, and we've already seen in the other studies, the fossil record, etc., that there is not in fact any actual evidence, much evidence indeed against evolution. So let's look at, first of all, embryology. I'll just make a few review comments about covering the things we just got into last week so we can bring us up to speed here. Remember the phrase ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Scientists love to use fancy words so that the rest of us don't know what they're talking about. But ontogeny is the term for the study of the embryological development. Not the study of, but embryological development. And phylogeny is evolutionary development, or the family tree. And so what they're saying is, if you look at the embryo, developing embryo of various creatures, and particularly and especially of man, that's their favorite, that you will see as the embryo develops into its fetal stage, and that there are phases or stages, they claim, that the embryo goes through in which it reflects its evolutionary ancestry. And so since we evolved from fish, you'll find, they say, in the early phases of development, gill slits in the embryo, which is a recapitulation of our fish stage of our evolutionary development. Okay, now who had a question?
Do they have a picture where we go to the plant stage?
No, I don't think they got us in the plant stage. No. Thanks, Kelly, for that question. Well, I don't know if anybody's ever connected the plants and the fish, but that's again one of the mysteries of evolution. The whole plant thing. Does anybody know anything about plant evolution? I mean, I've really never seen anything on plant evolution, so I think that's kind of a separate deal altogether. But this claim that as you study the embryos, that it recapitulates, each embryo recapitulates its allegedly evolutionary ancestral history, is still being repeated in both high school and college classrooms and on the textbooks for those schools. And there are many who still believe it, actually. But in fact, a long time ago, it was basically discredited, and the evidence is sufficient to say that it's nonsense, that what we're going to be looking at here simply isn't so. And the evolutionists who are serious, as a rule, don't bring this up. Yes. Michael, did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. No, that Michael. I thought that you were trying to say something. I quoted from 1932 Waldo Shumway from the University of Illinois, who is an evolutionist. His comments on the theory of embryological recapitulation, which is also called the biogenic law, and he said that a consideration of the results of experimental embryology seems to demand that the hypothesis be abandoned. Again, that's a quote from somebody who would love to be able to say it's true. In fact, most of the quotes I give you, I've given you quotes and will be giving you quotes from creationists on all these things, but most of the quotes I give you are from evolutionists. And the quotes I'm giving you are negative in the various areas that we're commenting about. But remember that these are people who would just give anything if what they were rejecting were true, and they didn't have to reject it. So they don't have a bias against these things. They have a bias toward wanting them to be true, but these are honest men who are saying, oh, it doesn't hold up. We quoted also last week Walter J. Bach of the Department of Biological Sciences of Columbia University from Science Magazine in 1969, and he said the biogenic law has become so deeply rooted in biological thought that it cannot be weeded out in spite of its having been demonstrated to be wrong by numerous subsequent scholars. Where we left off last week, I quickly read through the article from the World Book Encyclopedia on embryology within the overall article of evolution. And I'll try not to read all of it again, but we do need to read it to, again, get back to where we were when we left off last week and hear what they have to say about embryology. Now remember, long ago, serious scientists within the evolutionary field, by the way, that magazine you just got back there, Peter, I'd like to talk to you about that later, please. I'm going to need some copies out of there before you take it home. Anyway, in spite of the fact that long ago serious scientists saw that they couldn't hold up an argument from embryology and for this recapitulation, as late as 1977, my particular year edition of the World Book still had an article like this in it. Embryology. Much evidence for our ideas of evolution comes from the development of individual living things, especially animals. Now notice that phrase, much evidence. That in itself is a loaded assumption. To say we can interpret this way is one thing, but to call it evidence makes it sound like this is actual proof. It says such development is much like stages through which large groups of animals have passed during the Earth's long history. Let us take two examples. Facts from fossils. We've seen what those kind of facts are. Plus other data have shown that mammals, animals which have solid bones, warm blood and lungs and breathe air and nourish their young with milk, form the last stage in a long evolutionary series of development. Notice the statement, facts from fossils plus other data have shown that mammals have so evolved. That isn't true. It goes on, this series began with little sea-dwelling creatures which had gristly rods instead of backbones. Today, an unborn mammal such as a dog develops that same gristly rod, next gets a backbone of cartilage, and then turns the cartilage into bone. Like that, I can see that dog working hard at turning his cartilage into bone. While this is being done, the embryo develops gills like a fish, loses them, and builds up 2 lungs. At the same time, the dog's heart develops through fish, amphibian, and reptilian stages until it becomes the 4-chambered organ which pumps blood so efficiently that the animal can keep warm. Now, that makes it sound like it's actually going through these fish, amphibian, and reptilian stages. Not that it has the appearance to them of being something similar to a fish or an amphibian or a reptile, but stating that it does go through those stages. That simply is not true. And as we're going to be seeing, what they see is only an appearance, an illusion, and isn't at all what they say it is.
What if it did?
Pardon me?
What
If it did, it wouldn't prove anything either. But I mean, what's amazing is that it doesn't, but they say that it does. Okay, well, I'll skip the rest of the article. It gives the other example, those catfish we talked about last week, but that's not critical to go through. Now, even before Charles Darwin came on the scene, evolutionists were making these claims, claiming that embryos went through these stages and indicated the common ancestry of all the different creatures involved, man down to his fish ancestors. And as I said, textbooks are still presenting this and showing sketches of embryos of chickens, rabbits, and lizards alongside of men, those of men, making note of what they would consider striking similarities between them, and therefore saying, see, that proves it. It's evidence. Documents it. And even though they can draw sketches that have these similar looking shapes and markings and forms on the early embryonic stage of any of those creatures or man, and then they just say, see, it proves that we went through that ancestry originally, and we're going through the stages in the development to what we are today. That, of course, is their claim. There is no evidence to support that, but it sounds good. And the average student in school hearing that goes, well, yeah. Commenting on this, Dr. Henry Morris, in his book called Scientific Creationism, says this: this type of similarity proves common ancestry no more clearly than it proves common design. On the assumption of creation, since most higher animals were designed to reproduce their own kinds by the same type of reproductive process, it would be expected that embryonic development would be similar for all such animals. Since the embryonic animal begins its existence in each case as a single-celled union of two parental cells, and the following cell multiplication must operate for some time in the same type of environment, a womb, for example, and since furthermore many of the structures to be developed must be somewhat similar, limbs, heads, etc., it would be natural that the developing embryos would look much alike for the initial stages of their development. He goes on and says, at such time, however, it has become, as it becomes necessary for specialized characters to begin to form in the embryo, corresponding to the parental kinds, then these superficial resemblances give way to the appropriate distinctive characteristics. Actually, he says, these significant differences show up quite early in the embryonic development. He says the differences, even at the initial stages, are again much more important than the similarities. The DNA for the chicken is utterly different from that for the lizard, even though the difference is not obvious visually. The distinctive genetic code programmed for each kind of animal assures that only that kind of animal will develop from the embryo. Superficial, brief similarities are irrelevant to the evolution-creation question. The intricately designed differences constitute the greater reality. So he's addressing what Mike said a moment ago. So what if even if it did go through those similar stages, which it isn't actually doing, it only has an appearance of looking alike in the earliest stages. Okay, now there was reference to gill slits in that article on embryology from the World Book. Let's talk about gill slits. This is the one all kids in school have heard about and know about, gill slits. Well, the embryo has gill slits, so it must have been a fish originally, you know. Those who advocate embryological recapitulation have this popularized notion that the human embryo, as well as all the different mammals, reptiles, and birds, have gill slits during the early stages of development. Now, the human embryo, when you study it, has a series of bars and grooves in the neck region of the embryo called pharyngeal pouches, or pharyngeal, I'm not sure how that's pronounced actually, which superficially resemble a series of bars and grooves in the neck region of the fish, which do develop into gills. So if you look at the embryo of a fish in its early stages and compare it to the embryo of a human being or any other mammal, there's this superficial appearance of being the same thing with these bars and grooves in each. In the human, however, as well as in the other mammals and birds and reptiles, these pharyngeal pouches do not open into the throat, and therefore they can't be slits. They're not openings. Okay? And they do not develop into gills or into any respiratory tissue at all in man or any of the others that have these appearances. So they can't be gills either. They aren't openings, so they're not slits. They don't develop into respiratory tissue, so they're not gills. So they're neither gills nor slits. So how can they be gill slits? Well, they call them gill slits because then it allows them to say, oh, see, look, fish has gill slits. Human embryo has gill slits. They call them that, and they get away with that. In the more serious text, I have a quote here somewhere, in fact, it's coming up here, that indicates that they've given a different name to it for just that reason, because they aren't gill slits.
Don't those folds become organs?
Well, I was just going to say, actually what develops out of those in the human, they develop into glands, certain glands, and the lower jaw and structures of the inner ear, is what those things, those bars and grooves become. In his Medical Embryology book, the name of the book is Medical Embryology, Jan Langman said, quote, since the human embryo never has gills, or bronchia is the scientific name for gills, the term pharyngeal or pharyngeal arches and clefts has been adopted for this book, unquote. So I mean, he's trying to be honest and get away from the misleading terminology. Okay, reference was made in that article to the human heart and the development of the human heart from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 chambers, and going through all those stages. If the human embryo recapitulates its assumed evolutionary ancestry, the human heart should begin with 1 chamber, go to 2 chambers, and then 3 and finally 4 chambers. Okay? Because lower life forms have, sometimes less than 4. They have 3, they have 2, they have 1-chambered hearts. Instead, what happens is the human heart begins as a 2-chambered organ when it first appears in the embryo or the fetus, and it fuses then into a single chamber. It becomes 1 after it's been 2, and then it develops directly into 4 chambers. It never does become 3. So the sequence is 2, 1, 4 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, which would be required by the theory if it's going through that series of supposed ancestral stages of development. Furthermore, the heart develops before the blood vessels, which is out of the assumed evolutionary sequence, because in the very lowest life forms, they don't even have hearts. They might have a vascular system of some kind without even having a heart. And so the fact that we develop the heart in the human embryo develops a heart before it develops the vascular system is backwards. Again, if you're trying to demonstrate an evolutionary sequence. The human brain is another one. The evolutionary concept of the lower forms evolving into the higher forms holds the brains of various creatures as being a later development, and having allegedly begun in earlier life forms as a primitive, gradually developing nervous system, which, grew a brain onto it as it evolved until it gets to man with the highest developed brain of all. But in the human embryo, the brain develops before the nerve cords do. Again, backwards from the normal, predicted, and believed evolutionary sequence. In recent years, I don't actually know how long it's been around. It's been around for a while, but it's relatively recent. Sometime in the last 20 or so years, I believe. There's an instrument they've developed called a fetoscope, which enables them, they insert this into the uterus, and they can observe and photograph every stage of the development of the human embryo and fetus. I've seen pictures of, embryos and fetuses, and I'm wondering, what do? Abort this baby to get these pictures? But they don't. They can actually go in there and photograph every stage. So we have not just somebody in a lab taking a baby, a fetus, early embryo out of a dead person and just kind of poking around and looking at it. We're talking about looking at it in its actual living situation and observing its development and growth and seeing what's really going on. Put it on high speed. What? Somebody else have something? Okay. What's the result of being able to do that is they now know that every stage of the development of the fetal development process is uniquely human in the human fetus. And the whole idea of embryological recapitulation is just simply a farcical dream on the part of the evolutionists who are desperately trying to find anything to support their point of view. So that didn't work. And another one of their favorite ones then is vestigial organs. I looked it up in the dictionary, and the term vestigial, I've known for years what it's in reference to, but I was curious to know how they would define it. The term vestigial is defined as one remaining as a vestige or a trace, something left over. And in biology, the second definition then is no longer fully developed or useful. A vestigial organ is one that's no longer fully developed or useful. So the definition of a vestigial organ is that an organ in our bodies that they label as vestigial, or any of God's creatures, whether it be human or otherwise, is the very fact of calling it vestigial is evolutionary in its premise to begin with. The idea being that, we used to need this thing that we call a vestigial organ, but we don't need it anymore, and it's gradually just disappearing for disuse. And again, even before Darwin developed his particular Darwinian approach to evolution, there were evolutionists, there always have been evolutionists, and they considered even then certain parts of our bodies to be no more than simply useless vestiges of organs that used to be of value to our ancestors, our animal ancestors. And as a matter of fact, there was a point in time when the evolutionists listed over 180 vestigial organs in the human body. Now, before I go any further, does anybody have an idea what that really means? Why did they have a list of 180 vestigial organs in the human body? Because what? Because they didn't know what they were for.
I think we should have went to those scientists and just yanked them out.
Yeah, right. Let's just pull this thing. You don't need this. And that's the whole point. They are so arrogant, they believe that if they don't know what it's for, it can't have a purpose. Okay? There were at that time organs which nobody understood in terms of what their purpose or function was in a perfectly designed human body. Now, our approach as creationists says, I don't know what the thing's for, but it's obviously for something. God put it there for a reason. And by the way, the same philosophy attaches on either side of the issue on the subject of something as simple as nutritional supplements. You know, the medical profession, they've been taught, and they always say, well, there's no difference between natural and synthetic. What they do is they will create a synthesized chemical form of some vitamin, like vitamin C, ascorbic acid. They manufacture it in the laboratory, and it's pure ascorbic acid. There's nothing else there. Now, God put vitamin C in a complex of nutrients, and there are specific nutrients that attach to and you're found with vitamin C in nature. But they say, well, that's not important. All you have to do is take this synthetic stuff and it'll do the job. Well, we don't know what a lot of those things that are there with the natural vitamin C that naturally occur with it, we don't know what all they do. So they assume that they're not doing anything or they're worthless. We assume God designed it that way, and therefore we should be taking whole, natural food supplements if we're going to take supplements. And because even though we don't know why or what, they're doing something. God had a purpose for those things being there. Well, the same thing with this. They assume arrogantly that if they don't know the reason for it or a function of something, it doesn't have any function. However, as the years have gone by, increasing knowledge has shrunk the list so that the number of vestigial organs now is reduced almost to zero. There are a few that are still considered by some, but not by all, evolutionists as vestigial. And by the way, there were even creationists, I think, who fall into the trap of thinking, because they've been taught these things, that certain things aren't important. And that's just not thinking. They've been taught it as kids, and we all have been taught that our appendix is completely worthless, in fact, nothing but trouble. And when I was a kid, they were still saying tonsils were worthless and nothing but trouble. Let's take them out. We'll be looking at that in a minute as we go on here. But because they have not, some of these things don't have an absolutely proven specific function and purpose, they're still holding out that a few of these things are vestigial. You'd think that after that list of 180 got down to maybe 2 or 3 or 4 things at the most, that they'd say, whoop, we might as well assume there's a purpose for these things and not make fools of ourselves any longer. But they don't. In the past, important organs such as the thymus gland, the pineal gland, the tonsils, the coccyx, the tailbone, were all considered to be vestigial organs. Let's look at some of those and see what's happened with them. The thymus gland and the tonsils have now been proven to be involved in the defense in our bodies against disease. It's a part of our immune system. Doctors used to routinely take tonsils out. If they got even a little red, put them in the hospital, pull those tonsils out. Just get rid of them right now. Save trouble for the rest of your life. No more sore throats. But doctors have finally learned that kids that had their tonsils taken out got sick a lot, and a lot worse sick than the ones that had sore tonsils. And when tonsils got sore, all it was a defense system to protect the rest of the body. And that's how it was supposed to be. They're supposed to get sore when you're being attacked. And so they're no longer removing tonsils like they used to do, even when they're sore and infected. They now, unless they're really bad, unless the infected tonsil is threatening the life of the person, which would be a pretty rare situation. I'm just even assuming that could be. I don't even know that that's even true, but they're not taking them out anymore like they used to do. There are probably some diehards that are still trying to yank tonsils, but as a rule, they're not doing that anymore. The pineal gland has been known now for a long time to be vital to many functions of the body, as is the pituitary gland. And I'll read you an article here from the Encyclopedia of Common Diseases, put out by the staff of Prevention Magazine, which is a health-oriented organization and puts out a health magazine. This is a part of their article on the pituitary and pineal glands. It says the next step, this is in the context of looking for a particular help in an area of a particular concern they were looking for. It might have been arthritis. I'm not sure because he refers to arthritis later in the article. But so this particular thing, I'm going for what they're saying about the pineal gland, and I'm taking it out of context in that sense. It's not critical that I'm taking it out of context, but I don't know what they're talking about. When they say the next step was to check on the medical literature, there was little to be found, but there was one research scientist, Dr. Richard Hortman, who had done a great deal of work in the area, an associate professor of endocrinology at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Dr. Wertman had formerly been at the National Institutes of Health, where he had intensively investigated the effect of light on the pituitary and the pineal glands, finding that both of these glands of the brain were stimulated by ultraviolet light entering the eye. Both these glands are key glands in the entire endocrine structure of the human being. Not only do they play their own roles in control of such basic functions as growth and maturation, but their hormone secretions also control the activities of entire systems of other glands. Their health and activity are universally understood to be vital to the health and activity of the entire body. And while we know of no studies that can show a direct relationship between these glands and arthritis, the lack of such studies might well be precisely the reason why no specific cause for arthritis has yet been discovered. Anyway, so again, the evidence now indicates the pineal gland is an essential gland to the human body. The coccyx, or as I said before, the tailbone, has always been viewed as a useless vestige of a tail in animals. But in fact, it's been now proven to serve an important function as the anchor for certain pelvic muscles. And in fact, if you will, the foundation or base of the entire spine. My chiropractor has made this point more than once over the years when I've been in, that when I have a problem in my upper back, a lot of times he has to adjust the lower back to fix that before he can get the upper back to stay good when he adjusts it. Because if the lower back is out, the foundation is out, and it'll affect the upper back. So the coccyx is actually the foundation of the entire backbone and the firm base on which it all sets. And in fact, if the coccyx gets out of position, like other vertebrae, it can cause all kinds of problems. Furthermore, they've demonstrated that a person cannot sit comfortably after, for whatever reason, they may have surgically removed the coccyx from somebody. They can't sit comfortably. The little toe, our little toe is viewed as a vestigial organ, if you will, or a toe. It's just gradually, because it's small, they think it's disappearing gradually and it's not important anymore. And you look at some of our alleged ape ancestors, they have much bigger toes, And I mean, after all, what can you do with that little toe? It's just kind of a mere nothing. And so it's been viewed as a vestigial organ, as they would describe it, as an ever-shrinking vestige of our distant ancestors. However, the fact of the matter is people who've lost their little toes have trouble maintaining their balance. At first, they fall down. And I've thought about it at different times when I'm just standing, and sometimes every once in a while I'll just have one of those kind of lucid thoughts and you think about something you don't normally think about. And I realize that as I'm standing there, I'm not just standing perfectly still. I'm just kind of moving around, shifting a little bit here and there. And I realize that if I start tipping to one side a little bit, my little toe is what pushes against the ground inside my shoe to push me back. Something as simple as that. Now, they couldn't figure that out, so they said it's a vestigial organ. The appendix, long thought to be an utterly useless appendage and still one of the few that's held by many evolutionary of an evolutionary mentality to be a vestigial organ. The World Book Encyclopedia has the following article on the appendix. This goes again back to 1977. I haven't checked the more recent editions, but I suspect it'll be the same. The title of the article is Appendix, Veriform. Is a narrow tube closed at one end. The open end attaches to the first part of the large intestine called the cecum. It lies in the lower right part of the abdomen. The veriform or worm-like appendix is found in man, the higher apes, some rodents, and various other animals. Maybe we didn't evolve from ape. Maybe we evolved from a rat. Rodents, such as the rat, have a long appendix that functions as a digestive organ. In man, it probably has no function. Some persons believe it lost its function through evolution. When inflamed, it causes a disease known as appendicitis. And of course, what do they do as soon as you get that? Cut it out. In fact, today it is still common, by the way, if you are having any kind of surgery that's anywhere near your appendix, they'll often yank it just because they're there. And if you ever have to go in for surgery, you make sure they might do that they know that they might do that, and tell them you're not giving them permission to take out your appendix. And if they do, they could have a lawsuit on their hands. The only time it's appropriate to take the appendix out is when it's actually threatening, totally infected and threatening to burst, and there's nothing they can do to reduce it. Because if it does burst, it can cause all kinds of havoc and problems, though you can live through that. contrary to popular opinion. But otherwise, your appendix, I believe, serves a purpose. I don't know what that purpose is. I do think it has something to do with fighting off disease and problems, and I think there is evidence that a lot of people have colon cancer have had their, not all, but a lot of people who've had colon cancer have had their appendix removed. And the people that have trouble with their appendix and do have inflamed appendix are on low fiber instead of high fiber diets. And so the problem really isn't the appendix, it's the diet. Okay, reading from the Encyclopedia of Common Diseases has the following article on the so-called uselessness of the appendix. The title of this article within this section of the book is called, "Is the Appendix Really a Useless Leftover?" For years, doctors have considered the appendix to be a vestigial organ, that is, one used by man in some earlier stage of history, but no longer of any apparent physiological use. The only thing the appendix could do, according to the medical consensus, is become inflamed, causing painful appendicitis. For years, the surgeon's rule of thumb has been to remove the appendix if operating near it. However, several doctors have warned that the appendix, as well as other parts of the body not yet credited with specific functions, may indeed have a vital purpose today, and that removing a healthy appendix may lower the body's resistance to invading disease organisms. The growing case against unnecessary surgery, particularly the offhand removal of parts of the body thought to be vestigial, was strengthened by a report from the Medical College of Ohio at Toledo. A study involving the case histories of 1,165 patients revealed that almost 67% of the patients who had developed cancer of the bowel before they reached 50 years of age had had their appendixes removed. Women who had prior appendectomies were more susceptible than men, noted Dr. George Pandanelum, if that really is his name, assistant resident in surgery at the medical college, who reviewed the clinical histories and raised the possibility that the appendix may help protect its owner from cancer. Including patients of all ages, 28% of those suffering carcinoma, that's cancer, of the bowel, were missing their appendixes. Dr. Pandanelum called this information statistically significant, compared with the percentage rate of appendectomies in other types of cancer and in people who had experienced heart attacks. In other words, they took other types of cancers and heart attacks, and they looked and found that there was not nearly that high a percentage. It wasn't like that was some kind of an average for everybody on the appendectomies. Dr. Pandanelum, I still can't say it, Pandanelum reported that the appendix could produce antibodies against viruses responsible for carcinoma of the colon, and appealed to fellow surgeons to think twice before removing the mysterious organ that is often called vestigial. Until the relationship of the appendix to cancer can be defined more clearly, he said, doctors should not remove a normal appendix while operating in that area of the body. The practice known as incidental appendectomy could be especially unfavorable to young people, the doctor concluded. I avoided reading his name that last time. Just in general on this whole issue of vestigial organs, an evolutionist by the name of S.R. Scatting, a zoologist at the University of, here's another name I can't pronounce, Guelph, Guelph in Ontario, Canada. He lists two main arguments against the notion that so-called vestigial organs offer support for evolution. This is from a magazine published in 1981 called Evolutionary Theory, and he said this. Here are the two reasons against calling vestigial organs evidence or support for evolution. One, practically every supposed vestigial organ has been shown to have a useful function. Two, it's impossible to demonstrate conclusively that an organ has no function. So he concludes that vestigial organs provide no evidence for the theory of evolution. This is an evolutionist. Commenting on this matter of vestigial organs, Henry Morris, again in his book Scientific Creationism, said this. A long-cited evidence of evolution used even before Darwin is that certain vestigial remnants of assumed former evolutionary changes can still be seen in the structures of organisms living today. These remnants are of two main types, the so-called vestigial organs and recapitulating embryos, which we've already talked about. These are assumed to have significance as a record of former evolution, but no longer to have utility in living organisms today. He says, if these features really exist, the creation model could explain them in terms of the decay principle associated with the second law of thermodynamics. He's not saying there really are organs that are truly vestigial, but if they even did exist, he could explain it from our creation point of view, from the effects of decay, from sin and the second law of thermodynamics. He says at most they would not testify of evolution into higher order, but rather of decay into lower order. In this case, the creation model would not actually predict such features, but at least it could explain them as well as the evolution model, which would not have predicted them either. He goes on to say, in conclusion on vestigial organs, he says, in view of the history of the subject, it would seem the better part of wisdom not to claim any organs at all as vestigial. The ignorance of scientists about the specific functions of such structures does not prove that they have none, that is, no function. It is more likely than not that in the very few cases remaining, more intensive study will, as it often has in the past, reveal specific functions actually accomplished by these supposedly useless organs. So we've now just set aside the whole argument of vestigial organs. Okay, the next major area of study in which the evolutionists make a claim that evolution is evident and proven by the particular field of study is that of the study of homology. In the organic realm, there are many similarities between different kinds of plants and animals, and that's what the word homology comes from. Homologous, like, okay? And these similarities between the living things have been interpreted by evolutionists as evidence of common ancestry. And this belief in homology is based on what they call the study of comparative anatomy. I took a course in college, comparative anatomy. Sat around looking at different organs from different creatures that were similar. I mean, they charge you to teach you these things. Here's, again, the World Book Encyclopedia article on evolution has a section called Comparative Anatomy. Listen to what they say on comparative anatomy. Comparative anatomy. The bodies of plants and animals provide facts dealing with both relationships and changes. They do so especially when different structures of their bodies are compared, a method which explains the term comparative anatomy. Suppose we compare a human arm with the front leg of an alligator and a horse, the flipper of a whale, and the bat's skin-covered wing. At first, they seem utterly different, yet they actually show the same arrangement of bones, muscle, blood vessels, and nerves. This arrangement, moreover, can be traced in salamanders and newts, whose forelegs are so primitive that the bones have not yet hardened. Well, I'd like to know why they haven't hardened in all these millions and millions of years. And notice that statement, this arrangement, moreover, can be traced in salamanders. That's based on the assumption of evolution in the first place. More advanced creatures, that term is also evolutionary, more advanced creatures, from alligators to man, have inherited the salamander arrangement. Notice that we've inherited it. With changes which produce better legs, as well as arms, flippers, or wings. I'd like to know this. If a salamander had an alligator leg, would he be better off? No. His legs and his arms are designed perfectly for his body. And they work in his body perfectly well. In fact, couldn't be improved upon. Unless you're evolving. They go on, they say strata more than 200 million years old contain fossil animals called amphibians because they lived both on the land and in the water. The legs and feet of these animals were even more primitive than those of salamanders. Still older beds contain fishes with fins strengthened by bones arranged like those in the feet and legs of amphibians. We have to pause for a moment to turn over the tape.